Father Mark from Presentation Parish, once again speaking to my beloved parishioners about the apparitions of Our Lady of Fatima, and we're on the second to last apparition, the fifth apparition, which is a very short apparition, which happened in the month of September. Since it's short, that gives me a little time to speak about something else that actually occurs today. Today is the 18th of May, and it is the 100th anniversary of the birth of Pope St. John Paul II, who, can't really say he's a dear friend of mine, but he's a beloved saint, of course, much loved by all those who knew him during the many years of his papacy. And we know that the life of Pope St. John Paul II was very much tied to the whole mystery of the apparitions of Fatima, because as we heard when we learned about the apparition in July, the assassination attempt of Pope St. John Paul II was prophesied in the apparition of Fatima. So first I'll describe the apparition of Our Lady of Fatima in September of 1917. Again, it was a kind of a brief apparition, a very simple message, and it was kind of, you might say, a preparation for the great apparition and great miracle that was going to happen in October. Mary kind of prepared and told the children what to expect the following month. When the children arrived at the Cova da Iria, they first prayed the rosary, and then at around noon is when the crowds saw the flash of light and the little white luminous cloud that came down from the sky and hovered over the oak tree, and the children, of course, saw Our Lady. And Our Lady simply said again, "I want you to come here on October 13th, and that you continue to recite the rosary to obtain the end of the war." So Our Lady once again referring to the fact that the world at that time, 1917, was engulfed in this terrible horror of World War I. And then Our Lady spoke about what was going to happen in October, a little preview of what they would see. Our Lady said, in October, the Lord and Our Lady of Sorrows and Our Lady of Mount Carmel and Saint Joseph with the child Jesus will come to bless the world. And so you can see that Our Lady describes the series of apparitions that the children would see the following month in October. And then Our Lady spoke a little bit about sacrifices. And we know that in this time of pandemic and quarantining, all of us are going through difficult struggles, being locked up or cooped up in your home, and it might be difficult. And what are these? These are, you might say, involuntary sacrifices. Difficult things that are imposed by the health officials, by the government. Now even the church authorities are telling us that we can't have public masses. These are difficult things. They are like sacrifices, but they're things that we didn't choose. Well, the message of Our Lady of Fatima, perhaps you might say, helps us in this time to realize that sometimes it's good to not only accept the involuntary sacrifices, but perhaps even choose to do some voluntary sacrifices. And a number of times in the apparitions of Our Lady of Fatima, she spoke to the children about the seriousness of sin and how little sacrifices can help save them. Of course, we know that prayer helps to save souls, but Our Lady said sacrifices. And perhaps it does make sense, because we know that what really saves sinners is the cross. The suffering of Jesus on the cross, right, saves souls so they go to heaven. But by God's grace, we participate, we can collaborate. Mary was at the foot of the cross, helping to offer her son's sacrifice, and apparently we too also can offer our little sacrifices, the involuntary ones and the voluntary ones, to God. And so the children gradually, with the apparitions of the angel and the apparitions of Mary, they started to do little sacrifices. They would fast. They would sometimes give their lunch to the sheep or to the poor. They would sometimes not drink water on hot days. They started wearing uncomfortable things, They started, for example, once the children found a very rough kind of a rope, and with rocks they sort of had to cut it into 3 lengths, and they would wear it. This was a common thing in ancient times. People would wear something uncomfortable under their regular clothes, and so the children put this rope under their clothing, and it was just a little bit scratchy, a little something to remind them to pray and to offer up this little sacrifice. Well, Our Lady referred to these kinds of sacrifices. She then said, "God is pleased with your sacrifices, but He does not want you to sleep with the rope around your waist. Use it only during the day." And Mary said this because the youngest, Jacinta, was very enthusiastic about saving sinners, and she was wearing the rope at night, and she couldn't sleep at night. So what a beautiful detail that Our Lady, like a good mother, wanted the children to take care of their health. Of course, we make little sacrifices, but we also know that we have to eat right, sleep right, and do those things to keep ourselves healthy. And so again, I think this message of Our Lady of Fatima can help us in this time of pandemic, when there are difficulties and little inconveniences that we can offer up, and we can offer them up with those little prayers of Our Lady of Fatima. And after this came the end of the apparition. Our Lady simply once again rose into the sky, and the crowds saw that little white luminous cloud rise up into the sky. As I mentioned, today is the 18th of May, and it is the 100th anniversary of the birth of Pope St. John Paul II. And so to celebrate his birthday, I want to speak a little bit about this beloved saint, this beloved Pope of our modern times. I was able to study for 5 years in Rome, and a number of times I was able to see him close and to even shake his hand, and it was a great blessing for me. Maybe 2 things really influenced me to have great love for the Blessed Virgin Mary. The first would be my time here at Presentation of the Blessed Virgin Mary Parish, growing up, catechism, being taught to say the Rosary by the catechism teachers here in this parish, and the priests who inspired me with great love for the Legion of Mary and for Our Lady and the Rosary. And then the other thing you might say would be Pope St. John Paul II. I'm sure that many young priests and seminarians can say that he was a great influence on their lives. And so just a few statistics about Pope St. John Paul II, how amazing his papacy was, and his life and his dedication to the church. He was, you might say, a real man of sacrifice and of love for the mission of the church. His name, of course, was Karol Joseph Wojtyła, and when he was very young, he had a number of very sad events. His mother died when he was 9 years old of childbirth, his mother Amelia, and his older brother Edmund died of scarlet fever a few years later. And so he was really raised by his father. And he can remember waking up at night and seeing his father kneeling in prayer. He said his childhood was his first seminary, the example that his father gave of faith in the church. And so he obviously began to think about dedicating his life to the priesthood. Nevertheless, as we know, he also had a lot of friends. He enjoyed sports, soccer, skiing, kayaking, swimming in the Słatka River there in Poland, in the mountains. He would love hiking, all of these things. And he was also very interested in theater, and he would write plays and poems, and he was very much considering a life of being an actor. However, little by little, especially perhaps with the onset of World War II, with the Nazis invading his country, he really thought about the seriousness of life, and he eventually decided to give up the idea of being married and being an actor, and instead being a Catholic priest. And so he began to study. For many years, he had to study in an underground seminary in Krakow, kind of running away from the Nazis and then later running away and hiding from the communists in order to study his theology. He was eventually sent to Rome and got a doctorate at Rome. So during these very difficult years, he suffered a lot. He actually had to work in a quarry and had to do hard labor. One of my favorite stories of Pope St. John Paul II is that while during the war, when he had to work in manual labor during his seminary years and then study in the night, one of the things that he would do was to bring a little book about the Blessed Mother to work, and it was getting all dirty, and it was a book by St. Louis de Montfort, who wrote the book True Devotion to Mary, which is a book that, when I was young as well, really inspired me to have great trust in Our Lady as our good mother who leads us to Jesus if we entrust or consecrate ourselves completely to her. His education continued, and he began to really, even as a child, he learned in boys' school German, Latin, and Greek, but eventually he came to know fluently 8 different languages. He was quite talented. Eventually he was ordained a Catholic priest in 1946, and then in 1958 he was elected as a bishop, the auxiliary bishop of Krakow, became archbishop of that city in 1964, became a cardinal in 1967, and in 1978 was elected the 264th Pope of the Catholic Church. He was the first non-Italian Pope in 400 years. And of course we know that his pontificate was one of the longest of the history of the Church, the 3rd longest. Only 2 other popes, St. Peter and one other, reigned longer. Pope John Paul II was the Pope for 26 years and 5 months. He was a great intellectual. He had a doctorate in philosophy, and he wrote many, many beautiful encyclicals and apostolic exhortations, hundreds of different letters and messages to the whole Church, which are very inspiring and insightful. He also had a hand, of course, we know, in producing the new Code of Canon Law, the 1983 revised Code of the Canon Law. And he was also responsible, of course, for the publishing of the Catechism of the Catholic Church in 1992. It's still called the New Catechism because the previous one was like 500 years ago, the Council of Trent. And so this catechism was a great event for the Church, and Pope St. John Paul II made sure that it happened. He presided over many synods, gathering the bishops of the world, 15 different synods, and then he was famous for traveling. He did 104 pastoral visits outside of Italy, and then 146 trips within Italy to different countries in Italy. And of course he was the Bishop of Rome, and so he would visit parishes and hospitals and orphanages, 700 pastoral visits to different places within his own diocese in the city of Rome. During his papacy, he traveled 698,000 miles, which is, they say, 28 times around the earth, or 3 times the distance between the earth and the moon. So he was really a pilgrim pope, traveling and visiting the people of God in every land. He also canonized many saints, more than any other pope. He canonized 482 saints, and he also beatified 1,342 new blesseds. He presided over the Great Jubilee, of course, the year 2000, and 8 million people came to his audiences during the Jubilee year. And he also established the Marian year. In 1988 was the great celebration of the 2000th anniversary of the birth of the Blessed Virgin Mary. He started the World Youth Day, which was very popular, of course, gathering the youth of the world. And also he established the World Day of the Sick, which is celebrated now each year on February 11th, which is the feast of Our Lady of Lourdes. He expanded the number of nations which the Holy See had diplomatic relations with, from 85 countries to 174 countries. And we know he survived several illnesses and accidents during his life. And of course, we know that on May 13th, 1981, he was shot in St. Peter's Square. amazing that this occurred on the feast of Our Lady of Fatima, May 13th, the anniversary of the first apparition. And of course we know that this was prophesied in the vision to the children in the month of July. This was the famous third secret that finally occurred in 1981. And we know the following year, Pope St. John Paul II went and spent May 13th in Fatima. And he famously took the bullet that had been taken from him. There was actually a little hole in the crown of the statue of Our Lady of Fatima in Portugal, which was just perfectly, seemed to be expressly made for putting that little bullet into the crown of Our Lady. I don't think anything is an accident. John Paul II came to the end of his pilgrimage of life in the year 2005. After a long struggle with Parkinson's disease and after celebrating and trying to address the crowds during the Holy Week ceremonies, finally he became weaker and weaker, and on the eve of the Feast of the Divine Mercy, on that Saturday night after celebrating a vigil mass of the Divine Mercy, he passed away on the very day of the Feast of Divine Mercy, which of course we know he himself had established for the Universal Church. So this was a great confirmation of the fact that this Feast of the Divine Mercy was his blessing for the world. The funeral of Pope St. John Paul II was the single largest gathering in history of heads of state outside of the United Nations. There were 4 kings, 5 queens, 70 presidents and prime ministers, and more than 14 leaders of other religions. It is likely to have been the largest single gathering of Christianity in history, with numbers estimated in excess of 4 million people gathering for the funeral in Rome. Pope St. John Paul II received many honors and prizes. He became the Man of the Year for Time magazine in 1994. Unfortunately, he never received the Nobel Peace Prize because perhaps of his very Catholic views and the fact that the world does not always appreciate and understand the Catholic teachings. But then, of course, he was beatified in the year 2011 and canonized as a saint in the year 2014. Here now is a picture of a very important moment in the life of Pope St. John Paul II, the day he met Father Mark Wagner. Actually, at the time I was a seminarian, my first year in Rome, we had a lottery and I won the privilege of being altar boy at the Midnight Mass for Pope St. John Paul II. I got to shake his hand at the end, so if you ever want to touch my hand, it's a third-class relic since I touched the hand of a saint. Well, God bless all of you, and may we continue in this month of May and on this anniversary of the birth of Pope St. John Paul II to imitate the love of the saints and of Our Lady for the Lord and grow in holiness ourselves. God bless you, and happy Easter season.